American colonies declared their independence in 1776, but it would take a long time for them to actually win recognition as an independent country from Great Britain. It wasn't until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783 where Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States, and only after about 100,000 Americans lost their lives. In this lesson, we're going to look at this war. We're going to examine why, or look at the factors that enabled this young United States to win this war and to defeat one of the great powers in the world. And we're also going to examine the impact of this war, how it affected the political system, American society, and the American economy. So first of all, we need to realize the advantages and disadvantages of both sides in this conflict. If you look at the war, and let's look at the numbers, this appeared to be a real David versus Goliath battle, Great Britain being the Goliath and the United States being the David. Great Britain had a population that was 3 times larger than the United States. Great Britain was one of the great commercial powers in the world. It had the largest economy in the world. The British Navy was the largest, the most powerful, most successful Navy in the world. And the British Army was well respected, well trained and experienced. You contrast that with the United States. The United States had no professional army until after 1777. That was 2 years after the war had begun. When the war began, the Continental Army had to rely exclusively on volunteers. These were primarily farmers with little or no military experience. Soldiers in the early years of the war in the Continental Army, they would sometimes leave the Army because they had to go home and tend to their farms. So there were times when George Washington didn't even know how many soldiers he had to fight for him because a lot of them were gone. Now, even though by the numbers it looks like the United States was at a severe disadvantage, they did have certain advantages over Great Britain. One thing important to remember was that Great Britain was trying to fight a war and direct a war that was 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. Now this created all kinds of problems for communications and for logistics. So that gave the British a lot of problems. Also, the British officers and the soldiers, they were operating in a strange and unfamiliar environment. They really didn't know the terrain or the territory. You know, today's Army, there's such an emphasis on intelligence and knowing what's going on. Well, in those days you had to draw information from the local population for information. And if the local population is hostile, like it was often the case, that posed a tremendous obstacle for the British soldiers. They didn't really know what was going on. Now, in contrast, the American soldiers were often fighting on land that they knew, that was their home. And so they knew the terrain, and so that intelligence difference gave them an advantage over the British soldiers and their commanders. Another advantage that the Americans had was that they generally possessed a much higher morale. Many of the Americans were volunteers. They believed that they were fighting in a great and noble struggle. They were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberty. They were fighting against tyranny and despotism. Now, the British soldiers and the Hessian mercenaries was a little different story. Back in Europe, the way they dealt with crime and homelessness was just to draft homeless people and the people in prison into the army. So often the soldiers who fought in the British Army and the Hessian Army were not there because of patriotism or loyalty. They were there because they had no other choice. And they were basically only fighting to survive. Plus they had to deal with very harsh discipline. The British officers were infamous for their beatings and their harsh treatments that they imposed on their soldiers. It was so bad that it was often the case that British soldiers and Hessian soldiers, they would go on over to the other side. They would desert and join the Continental Army, especially when the Continental Army began to offer signing bonuses and land grants to anyone who would sign up for 3 years to fight for the Continental Army. So there was a big morale difference between the British and the American sides during this war. Another advantage that the United States enjoyed was the fact that this war was very unpopular in Great Britain. I mean, for one thing, Great Britain was engaged in a war against fellow English speakers, and so that created problems. Lord North and George III had many critics in and out of Parliament. One of the most famous critics was the prominent member of Parliament, Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke had been very open in his criticism of how Lord North had handled the situation and was critical of the entire war. So basically, because of the political situation, Lord North and George III could not afford any mistakes. They knew that the war was unpopular, so they basically had to make sure that everything went smoothly. Because if things didn't go smoothly, they knew that support for the war in Parliament would collapse and their government would be in trouble. So basically, during the course of this war, the United States really did not have to full-on defeat the Great Britain. All they had to do was create enough obstacles to make the war not go smoothly for Great Britain, and that's exactly what they did. You see, during the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Army actually lost a lot more battles than they won. But they were able to win just a few number of victories, and these victories were enough to convince Great Britain just to call the whole thing off and to seek terms and recognize the independence of the colonists. Now, so let's look at some of those victories. One of these key victories was the battle known as the Battle of Trenton. This was fought on Christmas Day in 1776. Now, this battle came at a time, this victory came at a time when the Americans were really at a low point. See, back in the summer of 1776, the British launched a major offensive. It was actually the greatest invasion force that the British had ever put up to that time in their history. Over 30,000 British and Hessian troops launched an attack on New York City to gain control of this important port. Now, to fight this, Washington had a mere 19,000 troops. So he actually was outnumbered, and his troops didn't have experience, didn't know how to fight in battles, and they were easily routed and forced to retire. So quite easily, the British Army captured New York City. The Continental Army ended up having to withdraw down into Pennsylvania for the winter months. Now, George Washington knew that they had suffered a lot of defeats and his army was a little down. So George Washington knew that he needed to take some kind of measure to revive his troops. So he launched a secret attack. Instead of resting for the winter as was expected, he crossed the Delaware River in the dead of night on Christmas night, and there he found a bunch of drunk Hessians who were just kind of partying it up on Christmas Day, and he overpowered this garrison, and almost the entire garrison was captured. I mean, you're fighting a bunch of drunk Germans. Now, a week later, the Continental Army fought a very small skirmish at the Battle of Princeton against a British force, and this skirmish was also a success. Now, the capture of Trenton, the capture of those Hessian troops at Trenton, and the victory at Princeton were not major strategic victories. But what they did was to lift up the morale. The Americans had been under a lot of pressure, they'd been losing battles, and now, thanks to Washington's leadership and his daring maneuvering, they had turned things around and picked up the Americans, and that gave the Americans the courage to continue the fight. So you have the Battle of Trenton as a key. Now, another key victory was achieved about a year later at the Battle of Saratoga, which was fought in October of 1777. Now, this also came after a summer of disappointment. In 1777, one group of British troops launched an attack on Philadelphia. Philadelphia was where the Continental Congress was stationed, and basically the Continental Congress had to flee the city. I mean, again, Washington was unable to defend the city, and basically the Americans had to withdraw, and the British took over the city of Philadelphia. At the same time, another British force was advancing from north to south. They were marching from Montreal, and they were going to go past Lake Champlain, and the goal was to gain control of the entire Hudson River Valley. This was a very strategic valley, and if the British controlled it, they would be able to isolate and cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. Now, the problem for the British campaign was that it moved at a very slow pace. It turns out that the British commander leading this force from Montreal was a man by the name of John Burgoyne. His nickname was Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne. And he always had to live it up. So you know, when he brought his army down through the wilderness, he had all this baggage. He brought his French chef with him to make food. He brought his wine collection. He brought an orchestra. He brought tapestries to decorate his tent. I mean, this guy brought everything. He was going to travel in style. So he was traveling at this real slow pace, and what this allowed was for the Continental Army, under the command of Horatio Gates, to amass a pretty significant army. So it turns out that basically Johnny Burgoyne walked into a trap that and his army was surrounded by a much superior force. So in October of 1777, when it was clear that he was not able to force his way out of this trap and it was completely surrounded, he surrendered to the Continental Army. 5,700 men surrendering to the Continental Army. And this was a tremendous blow to the British, very embarrassing for the British. Now, this victory was key for a number of reasons. First of all, it really lifted the morale of the Continental Army. They'd suffered a whole summer of defeats, and one thing you have to remember is that in the winter of 1777, 1778, the Continental Army under the command of George Washington was spending the winter at Valley Forge, and it was a terrible winter. It was very, very cold, kind of like the last winter we had, and the American soldiers had shortages of food, and they had shortages of blankets and shoes and clothing, but they stuck together because they know that they'd won that victory. They defeated the British, and they were led by George Washington. They stuck together through that terrible winter. Another key result of the Battle of Saratoga was that the French decided to make an alliance with the United States. Now, why would the French do that? Well, remember, the French had lost the 7 Years' War to Great Britain. So Great Britain and France were complete enemies of each other. So basically, France saw an opportunity to avenge itself and to put one on the British. So thanks to the diplomacy of Ben Franklin, the French and the United States formed an alliance in 1778. And under this Franco-American alliance, the French pledged to wage war on Great Britain until Great Britain formally recognized the independence of the United States. Now, this French alliance was very important because, first of all, the French provided lots of money. They had money, they provided supplies, they provided troops, so they boosted the resources and the forces of the United States. Another key thing the French did was that they used their diplomatic skills and their links to convince Spain to join their war. Now, the United States never formed an alliance with Spain, but Spain in 1779 joined with France against Great Britain, and so did the Netherlands in 1780. So by 1780, Great Britain was facing not just the United States, but a coalition that involved France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And so that put even more pressure on the British to end the war. Now, the last key victory that occurred in this war was the Battle of Yorktown that was fought to the south in Virginia in October of 1781. Now, why was it fought in the south? Well, you see, after 1778, the British decided that they're going to shift their strategy. They just kind of figured that New England was gone, and they were going to just kind of save what they could, salvage what they could. So they decided they were going to keep on controlling New York City, which was a major port, and then they thought that they could continue their control over the southern colonies. The southern colonies, after all, were the wealthiest colonies because you had all that tobacco and indigo and rice. And also they were under the impression that in the South there was a much larger loyalist population than there was up in New England. You've got to remember that not all Americans were on board with independence. According to one historian, or a number of historians, in America, about 1/3 of the colonists were patriots who supported independence. Another third were loyalists who were loyal to the king. And another third were just kind of undecided, kind of just going with the flow. Now, it was believed that the loyalists in the South were quite numerous. And also, that belief was justified because in the South there was a large loyalist militia. A lot of, in the backcountry and former slaves had joined up to fight as loyalist militia, to fight as auxiliaries for the British troops. So with that in mind, the British launched a big campaign in the South. By 1780, they had occupied the ports of Savannah and Charleston. At the Battle of Camden in 1780, the Continental Army was crushed, was just completely defeated, and it was a big disaster. Now, it was at this point that the Americans decided to change their strategies. Instead of trying to fight the British in an open battle, they decided to use guerrilla-type campaign. They didn't call it guerrilla warfare back then. But, for example, the new commander of Continental troops in the South was a man by the name of Nathaniel Greene. His nickname was the Fighting Quaker, which is kind of a joke because Quakers are supposed to be pacifists, but he was, fighting for the American cause. So he's Nathaniel Greene, the Fighting Quaker. And he decided to, instead of fighting British forces in an open battle, to mount these kind of hit-and-run attacks, to kind of keep the British forces on their toes and to kind of wear them out. Now, he wasn't the only one doing that. Across the South, there are a number of guerrilla forces that are, whose exploits are legendary. There was one such person was Thomas Sumter. He was from South Carolina. He was known as the Gamecock. Gamecocks are fighters, cockfighting. And he had his own guerrilla band. Another one was Francis Marion. He was known as Swamp Fox because he would, whenever they would attack the British, they would hit and then they'd go back to the swamps. And so the British couldn't chase them. And then also another important thing happened was that in 1780, the Loyalist militia suffered a major defeat. What happened is that over in what is today Tennessee, East Tennessee, a bunch of men called the Over Mountain Men, because they lived over the mountain, they crossed over from Tennessee into Carolina, into North Carolina, and they did battle against the Loyalist militia. It's called the Battle of Kings Mountain. And it was fought on the border between South Carolina and North Carolina in 1780. And it was a big victory for the Over Mountain Men. And the Loyalist militia were crushed. So it was a big turning point in the war. Now, Charles Cornwallis, who was the British commander, by this time he was growing tired of trying to chase down the Americans. So he decided in 1781 that he was going to march right into eastern Virginia, where it's all nice and flat. And there he was going to fight a battle, an open battle, and just defeat the Continental Army in a big battle. That was his hope. But what happened instead was quite different. George Washington came down, and he was joined by French forces. And by this time, the Continental Army wasn't the bunch of weak, inexperienced men that it had been. By this time, George Washington had trained a pretty well, effective professional army. Remember, they started giving bonuses and such to get people to stay enlisted for 3 years. Well, George Washington now had a pretty good Continental Army. He also had French forces, and they marched south to meet Cornwallis in Virginia. Now, it turned out that the British fleet had been defeated by the French in the Caribbean, and so the French fleet showed up, and what happened is on the coast of Virginia, Cornwallis found himself in a situation where he was trapped. He had the Americans and the French on one side, and then the French fleet had him bottled up, so basically he had nowhere to go. So he had to surrender in 1781, and that was the final blow. I mean, after this defeat at Yorktown, where the British Army just basically had to hand over their sword to George Washington, this was humiliating. And what happened is that Lord North's government collapsed. It had no support in Parliament, and basically a new government was installed. George III, from this point, decided to not be involved in government anymore. He started on his road to insanity. But in 1782, Parliament voted to suspend hostilities and to open negotiations. So the Continental Congress sent 3 of its best negotiators, John Jay of New York, Benjamin Franklin, and John Adams, and in Paris, they negotiated the Treaty of Paris. It was under this treaty that Great Britain finally recognized the independence of the United States. And they also ceded to the United States a bunch of territory, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes to Florida. And it was also decided that Florida would be given to Spain. So Great Britain ceded to Spain, who was France's ally. They ceded to Spain Florida. All right, so we've looked at the key reasons for why the Americans were able to win the war. Now, let's talk about the impact of the war. Now, historians, when they talk about the American Revolutionary War, they debate a lot. They ask, was this, some people want to call this war a war for American independence. And some historians want to call this war the American Revolutionary War. Now, historians who say, hey, it was just a war for American independence, they'll say that all in all, the United States really didn't change all that much as a society as a result of this war. Other historians who call it the American Revolutionary War, they will say, no, this war brought about fundamental and major and sweeping changes in American society. It was a major shift, and therefore it was a revolutionary war. So what we want to do now is to assess which of these positions is correct. How much did America change? How much was American society revolutionized during this conflict? So to answer this question, what we're going to do is look at how the war affected the political system, how it affected society, and how it affected the economy. Okay, so let's look at the politics of it. Now, new states were formed, but in these states, you basically had a system of government where you had a governor, and in most colonies, you had a bicameral legislature, an upper house and a lower house. So essentially, it was the same structure that had been during the colonial period. And also, in the new independent states, most adult males could vote and hold office. And that would have been the case back in the colonial period. So you say, what really changed? Well, one thing's important to remember, that in 1776, all these states, these new independent states, they sent delegates to a convention, and they wrote and they drafted for each state a written constitution. Now, it wasn't a charter issued by the king. These were representatives of the people drafting and writing a constitution. That's a big radical change, a big innovation, and that was different. So that was pretty new and different for the time period. Also, it's important to remember that under this new system of government, it was a Republican system of government with a small r. In other words, the people who lived in these states were no longer subjects of a hereditary king. They were free citizens of a republic. They elected their leaders, and they weren't ruled by hereditary officials. Also, in a republic, all citizens are equal before the law. There is no hereditary aristocracy. There was no aristocracy to monopolize political power. Political office was open to all citizens. For example, in every new state constitution, the governors were no longer appointed by a proprietor or by the king. Governors were elected by the legislature or directly elected by the citizens of the state. So that would be an example of a Republican system of government. Now, it's important to remember that the Americans, they did not invent the idea of a republic. There had been republics going all the way back to the ancient days of Athens and Rome. And the writers of the United States Constitutions and the United States Constitution were familiar with the ancient works of Aristotle and Polybius, these ancient writers who had described the political systems of Athens and of Rome. Another source of inspiration for the Americans was the fact that there had been city-state republics in Renaissance Italy, in cities like Florence and Florence and Venice. Also, it's important to remember that England briefly had been a republic. Remember, under Cromwell, England had been briefly a commonwealth or a republic, and it actually had a written constitution. And in fact, during the period of the English Civil War, there had been political pamphlets that had been written that celebrated the achievements and the virtues of a Republican system of government. In fact, William Penn, who founded Pennsylvania, was a big believer in a Republican system of government. So the Americans, they knew about these precedents. They knew about these earlier examples of republics, and they could identify with these early republics like they identified with Rome, because Rome, like America, in the days of the Roman Republic, Rome was a nation of citizen farmers. One of the great heroes of Rome had been a man named Cincinnatus. Great story. And the story was that when Rome was attacked, he was out there working on his farm, plowing his land, and when news came that war was coming, he put away his plow, took command of the Roman armies, won the victory, and then was all said and done, he went right back to where he was, farming his land. And that was the ideal. Many Americans said, hey, we're like the Romans. We have a Republican system of government. We're a nation of farmers, of citizen soldiers, just like that. And also they identified with the Puritans who had fought the yeoman farmers, the Puritan farmers who had fought in the armies of the Parliament during the English Civil War. Many Americans identified with them. So Americans could identify with these earlier systems of government, these earlier republics, and that seemed a good fit for many Americans. Americans were also inspired by a philosophical movement that was popular among educated elites, and this movement was known as the Enlightenment. Now this movement had swept across Europe in the 18th century, and just in a nutshell, the Enlightenment spread the idea that human beings are naturally virtuous, and that human beings, it's in their nature to constantly seek to improve themselves and to establish progress through the use of their reason. You know, it's through the use of reason that societies and individuals can advance themselves. And it's important to remember that these ideas of the Enlightenment were an important factor in shaping the views of many prominent Americans. Ben Franklin was a prominent Enlightenment thinker. So was Thomas Jefferson. And for these men, they believed that the old system, the old monarchy, was regressive, that this new republic was something new, it was more rational, it was progressive, it would lead the human race forward to a brighter future. They believed that the old ways were outdated and needed to be changed. In fact, Thomas Jefferson himself was inspired by John Locke, one of the more famous political philosophers, English political philosophers, who believed in the natural rights of men and the idea that governments are formed by people, by the citizens, to protect those natural rights. And you can see the ideas of John Locke being expressed. So the ideas of this Enlightenment thinker are expressed and incorporated into the very Declaration of Independence that Thomas Jefferson drafted. Now, another factor shaping how Americans looked at government was that they were shaped by those radical English Whigs that we've already spoke of. Remember, according to the radical Whig view, centralized governments are dangerous because anytime you concentrate the power in the hands of the few, you're going to have corruption and tyranny. So therefore, there's danger in having any kind of centralized government. And you can see the influence of these ideas when these state constitutions were drafted in 1776 and 1777. For example, in all of these new constitutions, the state governors had very little authority. They couldn't even veto anything done by the legislature. More power was in the hands of the people through their elected representatives than concentrated in the hands of the governor. You can also see this influence in our nation's first constitution. The Articles of Confederation were drafted in 1776, 1777, and what they called for was a very weak decentralized central government because remember, they believed that concentrated government was a threat to liberty. So under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress had very limited powers. Most power, sovereignty and political power was at the state level, in the state legislatures. Under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress could not impose taxes or coin money or make treaties without first getting the approval of 2/3 of the state legislatures. And you should notice that there was no president or chief executive under the Articles of Confederation. So those are some of the big political changes. Now let's look at some of the social changes that took place. You know, if you think about it, the American Revolutionary War did not really fundamentally alter the social structure that already existed. What you find is that both rich and poor, wealthy merchants and planters, as well as artisans and farmers, people from across classes supported the independence movements. So they were a cross-section of society. Remember, John Hancock, the famous patriot, was the wealthiest man in all of Boston, and George Washington was a wealthy plantation owner in Virginia. So there was no kind of radical idea of turning society upside down with these patriots. But one thing we do see is that as a result of this new idea of a republic, is that during the course of the Revolutionary War, is that people who normally did not take a part in politics began to. Normally in the colonial period, farmers and artisans had typically shown a lot of deference to the merchants and to the planters as their betters. But now, because of this new Republican ideology, what we see happening in America was that common people, farmers, butchers, artisans, workers, shoemakers, you name it, they were running for office, holding office right alongside the rich and famous. So that was a big change. That was a difference than the way it had been before the Revolutionary War. Also, there were a lot of folks, the Loyalists, also known as Tories, who completely rejected this new ideology, and they remained loyal to the king. Now, Loyalists made up roughly about a third of the population, and many of the Loyalists were merchants and large landowners and plantation owners who were the old colonial aristocracy who could not stomach all these new changes. And many of them saw their land being confiscated. During the course of the war, state legislatures would order the confiscation of Tory property. They'd even sell off this property to raise money to fight the war. In fact, many landless Americans who fought in the Continental Army, they received cash payments for serving in the Continental Army, or they received land grants from the sale of land that had been confiscated from these Tories. So that was kind of a revolutionary action right there. But it's also important to remember that not all the Loyalists were aristocrats or wealthy. You know, a lot of backwoodsmen, a lot of people in the backcountry were Loyalists and served in the Loyalist militia, and also slaves, freed slaves, fought for the British Army with the promise of freedom. Now, it's estimated that about 100,000 American Tories who just could not stand the system of government, they left the United States. They went to Canada, they went back to Great Britain, they went to the Bahamas, they went to Jamaica, and even thousands of freed slaves were settled eventually by the British government in 1790 in Sierra Leone on the coast of West Africa. Now, so many of these people, hardliners who could not accept the new system, they just left, and that allowed for more people who did accept the new order to be in the majority. Now, let's look at how the war affected the economy. Now, one thing that happened with this war was that it freed American merchants from all these restraints on trade. So one thing that did happen was that American merchants began to venture into new markets more than ever before. So that was kind of a boom to the economy early in the war. Also, the state governments, to pay for the war, issued a lot of paper currency. They didn't have any gold or silver, so they would just issue paper currency to pay for the war itself. And now, at the beginning of the war, all this paper money kind of stimulated the economy because it put money in people's pockets, but it did lead to inflation, and that would be a problem down the road. Another thing that happened is that the confiscation of Tory property, that did allow certain families who were on the mark who were entrepreneurs to get these lands at really low prices and to become very wealthy. So some families, due to these auctions, who had been maybe moderate families, became quite wealthy when it was all said and done. So there was some economic change, but there wasn't a whole giant radical change in the overall economy. So basically what you could say is that the American Revolutionary War, it did bring out some changes, but you can't say that the American society that emerged after the war was entirely different than the one that had existed previous in the colonial period. Now, we've looked at the American Revolutionary War and how it impacted American society. After they had achieved independence, the United States had to come up with a system of government that would be effective. And we're going to talk about the drafting of the United States Constitution in our next lesson.